The very first acknowledgement in this book goes to my second grade teacher, whose name was Miss Van Solen. And she's the one who taught a Bible story when I was in second grade about Samuel, the young boy who heard voices in the middle of the night. And he would get out of bed and go to Eli and say, "So what do you want?" And Eli would say, "I didn't call you, go back to bed." And this happened 3 times. And finally, Eli said to Samuel, "Next time you hear a voice, why don't you say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel goes back to bed. He hears a voice and he says, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." And God actually speaks to this young boy, and he gives him a message that he's supposed to tell Eli the next day. And Samuel, in fact, tells Eli the whole message the next day. So my second grade teacher is reading this story to the class. The recess bell rings, and everybody runs out. And I'm transfixed in my chair. And I was always the first kid out to recess, organizing the athletics, and so I was glued to the chair because of the nature of that story, of God speaking to somebody. Very timidly, I walked to the front of the class, and I said, "Miss Van Zolen, does God still speak today?" And she was caught a little off guard, and she said, "What?" And I said, "In the story, God spoke to a young boy. Do you think that God still speaks to young boys today?" And she said, "Well, why do you ask?" And I said, "Because I think it'd be about the coolest thing in the world if God were to still speak, to people and to young boys today." And she said, "Well, I absolutely think he does." And she reached in the top drawer of her desk and she gave me a poem. And she said, "Maybe you would enjoy this poem. Take it with you when you go home tonight." And I did. Later on that night, before I went to bed, I read the poem, and I liked it so much that I read it several times and then committed it to memory. Next day I go to school and I'm about ready to go out for recess, and my teacher stops me and she said, "Did you read that poem?" And I said, "In fact, I did. I actually memorized it." And I thought she was going to faint. And she said, "If you memorized it, why don't you say it to me?" I said, "Okay, I can say it. Oh, give me Samuel's ear, an open ear, O Lord, alive and quick to hear each whisper of thy word, like him to answer to thy call, and to obey thee first of all." I thought she was going to pass out. I mean, the look on her face, a second grader, not just reading a poem, but memorizing one that she had given to me. She put her hands on my shoulders and she said, "Bill Hybels, if you listen for the voice of God and obey it, I think God's going to have an anointed plan, and he's going to put power on your life." And I remember thinking, well, whatever. But I ran out to recess, and that was that. But I've probably repeated that poem in my head tens of thousands of times. Still in there right now. You could poke me in the middle of the night, I could say that poem. So a few weeks ago, when I was just finishing the book, The Power of a Whisper, someone walked into my office and they had kind of a promotional copy of it. Not the real thing, but just a promotional copy of it. And I looked at it for the first time and I thought, wow, this all goes back to my second grade teacher. Just then, my assistant, Jean, came into my office with an email and she said, "You better sit down, Bill. I got bad news." And I sat down and she said, "Your second grade teacher just died." So I was holding the book, The Power of a Whisper, and the email about Miss Van Solen's death. And I thought, too strange, really, gotta be kidding me. And I was filled with appointments that day and the next day, and I got a whisper from God that the right thing to do would be to fly to the city where her funeral service was being held and to attend her funeral. So I thought about it and I prayed about it. I said, this is the right thing to do. So I canceled all my appointments. I chartered an aircraft and flew to this little city and stood by her casket and remembered what a second grade teacher did to just a young guy. 15 minutes after a class, and she gives me a poem, and she tells me that God still speaks, and that maybe my life could be anointed if I would listen for whispers. So that day, standing by her casket, I thought, yeah, that little poem and that concept of whispers changed the whole course of my life. And I have a real debt to pay to that woman. I did so, standing there at her casket. But driving away from that funeral kind of rededicated myself to the concept that I want to live with one ear open to heaven every day. And when I hear God speak, I want to figure out if it's really God and if it's really what He would want me to do. And if it is, I want to be able to pay the price. I want to, follow through with it regardless of the cost. And I want the rest of my life to be about that adventure, just a whisper-led, God-guided adventure. And I don't know where it's going to go, but, I want to be on that kind of path. Part of the reason I'm so passionate about this curriculum that you're all going through is because each of you might have kind of a Miss Van Solen moment where undeniably and unmistakably God speaks to you. And you realize He has spoken, and I need to bet the farm. I need to do something. I need to follow His bidding. And as you join into that kind of life, this is going to be quite an adventure for you. And I wish you well on this adventure.